just to sort of give you a little bit of background before the video starts. So this weekend, I think I may have mentioned to some of you, it was the regional mock trial tournament in Fresno, and I was fortunate enough, have been fortunate enough for the last 2 years to have been trying to start a team here. 2 weeks ago, we thought we weren't going to compete at all. When we left there by Sunday night, I had 9 students who I think probably learned more about themselves and had more fun than they had sober in a long time. So that was fantastic. So that was fantastic. I was very excited about that for them. The weird thing was, I called a student of mine midway through, and it's a student. Some of you have heard me tell the story of meeting Justices Thomas and Sotomayor. Okay, so she's the student who actually wrote the letters to those to them, and let me just get the sweat out of my face. So she's the student who wrote the letters to them. I hang up the phone and she sends me a text. You guys videoing yet? Okay. Can I tell you when to start? Yeah. Okay. Because this I don't want it. So this story. Actually, you can start now. So anyway, I hung up the phone and she sends me a text and it just says Scalia died. And actually what she said was, I hate to be the one to tell you, but Scalia died. And oddly, my response wasn't what I expected at all. And it wasn't that I was expecting to be happy, but I expected that I'd turn on political science mode and go, all right, what's all the outcomes and what's going to happen here? And it's the future of the court and all of that. And instead, actually, I was really, really sad. And I realized why I was sad had a lot to do with having met Justices Thomas and Sotomayor. So if you are so inclined, from what I hear, and hopefully it will stay that way, our local paper, the Press Democrat, I wrote a piece that afternoon in breaks during the mock trial about what I was feeling about Scalia and sort of what I hoped for our country. And it's going to be a close to home piece tomorrow. So I hope you guys can read it. It's really quite warm and fuzzy, so I don't usually do warm and fuzzy, so you know, but today's my birthday, so maybe that's why I'm feeling I think I have to pay for this if it goes up. I'm not kidding. Happy birthday is, you have to pay for it if it goes up. Not anymore? All right, we can sing. Go ahead. You still want to sing, or is it a moment? Too late. A moment. All right. Awesome. I stopped it. All right. So what I was thinking during this time, you can hear my voice cracking a little bit, so you'll have to excuse me for that. My thought was, and I talk about this in the piece, so I hope you'll read it. But what surprised me about what I was feeling about it was that I was incredibly sad because it felt like we were going to start dancing on the man's grave right now. And I feel like a little bit of that has happened. And there's a lot of politics that's going to play out. And quite frankly, we're going to spend quite a bit of time today, probably the whole time, talking about this. If I didn't come in here and talk about this, I would be committing educational malpractice. I'm teaching a class about the court, and I honestly think, I told my students this, I think this is potentially the second most important moment in American politics since I was born. I would call Watergate number 1. Can't think of number 2. I think this may turn out to be number 2. Because it is not only going to potentially change a presidential election, it is potentially going to change the court forever, and change decisions, and change all of it. It's going to, at the very least, it's going to affect the decisions that we've been talking about. Scalia had a very firm belief about the Commerce Clause. If you get another Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor type, I'm just saying as a type, because those are what we know President Obama has appointed in the past, that now shifts to a 5-4 decision going the other way. And now all of the Commerce Clause jurisprudence changes. How it changes, we don't yet know, but it changes. Discrimination law, criminal justice, First Amendment issues, all of these things that we care about, right? The things that we care about are going to shift one way or the other. They may stay the same, which in and of itself is a shift, because I think, I'm hearing a lot of Democrats who are getting a little too cocky for me, because they think this is their win. You know, that the right thing is going to happen, and if the Republicans screw it up, the Republicans are going to lose. And let me just tell you, as somebody who loves American politics, the minute you get cocky that you have the right answer and solution, you better start thinking again, because this is a chess match and everything depends on every other thing that happens. So what I wanted to spend some time today talking about, and again, this is the current court, so you know this very well. This is, once again, I have to thank my assistant, Cody Hoffman-Brown, who has a child, and despite that, she put together this PowerPoint for my babblings over the course of the weekend, but as a little gift, she put Notorious RBG just for me. So I thought that was great. So obviously, this is a court that's about to change. And what I really want to do today, and I'm going to get to all of this sort of political stuff, is that I first, because I don't want to dance on the man's grave, I do want to talk about him a little bit. And some of this we went over, and what we went over I'll go through fairly quickly. But I think it's important to first remember who he was, because even if I disagree with a great many of his decisions, there are also issues where I actually agree with him, and you might too. And you might be surprised by some of those. He was a bit of a radical on free speech rights. He was somebody who voted against a flag burning law, a flag desecration law. That somebody had burned a flag at the 1984 Republican Convention, that person was arrested. Scalia was one of the members of the court who said that arrest was unconstitutional, and so was that law. Because, I believe he really did feel much like Hugo Black, who was in some ways his similar but opposite person here. Like Hugo Black, who felt that the First Amendment was what it said. That Congress shall make no law affecting the freedom of speech. Again, he was appointed in 1986. He was from Queens. Did he attend Harvard? I want to say he attended Yale. It was Harvard. Okay. They all either went to Harvard or Yale, so that's confusing at times. He was, however, the first Italian-American member of the Supreme Court. Now, we know him I think, sort of in a strangely intimate way now. I would argue that over the past really 20 years, he has emerged as the most public figure on the court. Brian also is an incredibly public figure. I love these quotes because it says something about him as a human being. The first quote is about his children. He has 6 or 7 children. 9 children, sorry. It's even worse than that. I also like this quote because I'm a youngest child. So in a big family, the first child is kind of like the first pancake. It's not perfect, that's okay. There are a lot more coming along. So I like to think that my oldest brother was the first pancake and I'm the one they got right. If my mother watches this video, I'm sorry for that. My brother watches it, I'm not. Mere factual evidence, and I want to explain this one a little bit. Mere factual evidence is no reason not to carry innocence. Sorry. Mere factual innocence is no reason not to carry out a death sentence. This is a part of a series of cases where one of the cases in there was a death penalty case, and actually O'Connor wrote the decision of the court. And what had happened is that the death row inmate's attorney had missed a filing deadline and had filed late in state court. And so when they came to the federal courts, they said, we want this evidence we want this DNA evidence to be tested. We think there's evidence of this person's innocence. And so what O'Connor said was, this is a state issue. Your mistake was in state court. It's not our job as the Supreme Court to fix that problem. And so what often happened with Scalia, and I can appreciate this because it often happens with me, is he makes off-the-cuff statements that sound much worse than I think they necessarily are when you hear everything. But this one's pretty bad. Okay, this one's pretty bad coming from a Supreme Court justice, especially somebody who doesn't believe in death sentences at all. However, you know, it's hard not to recognize what he was on the court. You know, he was not, I don't think anymore, I think I said in the last class I taught you guys that the next 20 years is going to be, at least the way the court's set up now, it's going to be Kagan and Roberts as holding down the anchors of either side. And so in some ways, you know, Scalia, you know, Thomas is who Thomas is and sort of, you know, definitely marches to the beat of his own drummer. Scalia was never one that cared that much about making sure he had a majority all the time, or making sure that he wasn't dissenting. He was often fine in dissent, and sometimes seemingly happier because he could be a little bit more sarcastic and a little bit more of himself. So I would say that Roberts has sort of become the intellectual leader of the conservative side of the court. That's not to downplay exactly how important Scalia has been holding down that sort of conservative notion of originalism, because again, there are several different types, although lately he's been calling himself a textualist, and somebody yesterday asked me the difference, and I said it depends on who's asking him the question. So he graduated valedictorian 3 times. He worked for the Nixon administration during Watergate. He left the Nixon administration and went into academia. And I think in many ways he sort of found a home as the conservatives' answer to liberal academia. And he was never as famous as an academic as Judge Bork was, who some of you have heard of. Bork was far more conservative in many ways than Justice Scalia was. They almost served together on the court a couple years after Scalia got put on the court. But he was one of the first faculty members who really were advisors to the fledgling Federalist Society, which is a group of tends to be more conservative attorneys and lawyers who joined the Federalist Society. It started out in universities, and so it was students. He was one of the first faculty members who was willing to be a faculty advisor to this very conservative club.
What university?
He taught at Virginia and Chicago. I'm not sure which one he was. He made a certain role at both. But he was at both the University of Virginia and the University of Chicago. And really, this is where he started to make a name for himself. But he was still fairly young. He was still, not that well known outside of academic circles. And in 1982, he was put on the United States Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. I'm going to mention this a couple of times. I am going to talk about at least the public shortlist that I've seen that has been sort of leaked to Politico, I believe it was, on Saturday or Sunday. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals is in many ways really sort of a starting ground for the Supreme Court. Many of the clerks come from that court. Many nominees come from that court. Doug Ginsburg, who was a failed nominee right after Bork was a failed nominee, they both sat on that court. It really has always been, Roberts was a D.C. Circuit Court judge. It's always been a really good way, if you want to be a Supreme Court justice, to get yourself in D.C. circles. I want to really point out this bottom one and the bottom point that was made here. I won't make many promises today. I will tell you my opinions on things. I'll tell you what I hope happens. I'll tell you what my best guess says is going to happen. What I can promise you is whoever gets nominated will not be voted in 98-0. As a matter of fact, I wonder when that will ever happen again. He was voted in unanimously, and people look at this in a variety of ways. What you have to realize is what was going on at that exact time, which was, what had happened was Chief Justice Berger wanted to step down. And Reagan nominated Rehnquist to take his place. Well, Rehnquist was already sitting justice, and so that meant that he had to go through the entire nomination and confirmation process again. That left his seat open, and so Scalia was the one who was nominated for Rehnquist's old seat as an associate justice when Rehnquist became Chief Justice. Does that make sense? Rehnquist had already been on the court for 15 years almost. And I think in many ways, the Democrats, at least at the time, thought they had much more on Rehnquist than they had on Scalia. And so Scalia was the easy one to get through because he hadn't written as much, he didn't have as many decisions, and they had this memo. I don't know how many of you are fans of the West Wing. Yeah, my middle brother calls it the left wing. My older brother and I used to go down for Thanksgiving, and my brother was the first of us to have a really comfortable couch. And so like you could sit back on it and put your feet up. And Bravo used to have West Wing marathons all over Thanksgiving weekend. And so my oldest brother and I would sit there for the entire weekend and do nothing but stare, the West Wing Bravo marathon. My other brother would walk in and just be like, "You're watching the left wing again." And it's true, I will admit. But there's an excellent, and you can see this on Netflix, there's an excellent episode from, I want to say it was year 2 or 3, and maybe it was year 1, but it was about a Supreme Court nominee. They did 2 episodes like this. The first one was much better than the second one. And they had this guy that they were ready, and he could get in, and he was going to be great. And he was a moderate, but they could get the Senate to confirm him. And here we go, and we've looked at everything he's ever said, and how many people he's slept with, and whether there's a prostitute that's going to come out and say, "Hey, look at me," any of those things. That's what the White House is doing about their candidates right now, finding out if there's anything, you better tell us now. Better that we find out now and say, So anyway, in this episode, they find this unsigned note that he had written as a law student saying that he did not believe in a right to privacy. And for them, Sam Seaborn, who is played by Rob Lowe, who is actually a Republican, but that's besides the point, goes after him for this. And this is, oh my God, it's privacy, and he doesn't believe in it. Well, it turns out that's loosely based on a true story, which is that when Justice Rehnquist was a clerk for Robert Jackson, he had written a memo about Brown versus Board of Education, in which he argued that the Board of Education should win, that the Browns should not win, and that schools should not be desegregated by the court. Okay? He did write the note. We knew he wrote the note. His claim was that he wrote the note playing sort of opposition for Jackson. I don't know if that's true or not to this day, but they had this information about it. People were rightly pretty upset about the fact that you had the potential Chief Justice had written a memo saying that Brown versus Board of Education was wrongly decided. And so, they used this against him. Rehnquist got through. It was the closest vote in history for somebody who actually got through. At that time, Thomas, as it turns out, was closer for other reasons that had nothing to do with memos, but had more to do with Coke cans. And anyway, I can say that. So my point is, the 98-0, I think sometimes is a little bit misleading. Okay? However, he did get through unanimously. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think that other people can explain this stuff better. But he was an originalist. He claimed to be a textualist. It's hard to get an idea. But he was ideologically opposed to the notion of a living constitution. And Rehnquist wrote a piece once saying, "So if you believe in a living constitution, is my constitution dead?" you know, he really did he did not believe in this notion that the Constitution changes as society changes. Okay, so he's not somebody who firmly believes in the right to privacy, because the word privacy does not show up anywhere in the Constitution itself. Okay? And he was a very firm supporter of states' rights, which is one of the reasons he wasn't so crazy about the way Congress used the Commerce Clause in a case like Lopez that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So having said all of that, I want to talk a little bit about this. Some of this matters and some of it doesn't, but I think a few of these points are worth discussing again. 35 nominees, and that number may be different now, but I think that's right. In history, 35 nominees have not been confirmed. 11 of those by an actual vote at the Senate. And I think this is a sort of an important place to stop and talk about that, because I think this is where we start getting into the kind of what's going to happen from here kind of questions that I'm sure most of you wanted to ask when you came in. Is it hot in here, or am I just? It's actually hot? Do we have any control over the heat? None? Huh? Is there AC on? Anyway, it's fine. I'll just sweat. I'm sure it's a little bit attractive for all of you. Anyway, I think this is the first moment, because here's where we start getting into some of the political issues. If you had asked me 5 minutes after I found out Scalia was dead what I thought the most likely response of the Senate response was going to be, I would have said that President Obama was certainly going to nominate a candidate, and that at the very least Ted Cruz was going to filibuster. Now, Donald Trump can say he would filibuster all he wants. They're not letting him in the Senate, to do that. Ted Cruz actually can. Okay, so I think it's important. I don't necessarily think he will. I think he can. And so I want to sort of play Ted Cruz for a minute without a Canadian accent. We've talked about him way too much in this class, I think. But just to play Ted Cruz, is, what I was thinking for Ted Cruz is, right now you're not doing great. You're trying to appeal to your base, you're not trying to appeal to the rest of America. You need to win the nomination and then worry about winning the general election. There is a significant portion of the base that for whatever reason, does not want to see Barack Obama nominate and get that Supreme Court seat. Okay? They have arguments as to why he shouldn't, and I will tell you that I think they're crap. Okay? It's part of his job to do so. If it was November 15th, I would say he should not. Today, he should actually nominate somebody, but the political response from Ted Cruz makes sense to me, not because, because from his standpoint, he's doing what his base wants him to do, which is that he alone as a senator, short 60 votes for cloture, can talk and talk and talk, and the Senate will not be able to vote on the nominee. Does that make sense? Okay? So once the Senate hearings have taken place and the Senate gets to vote, if a senator wants to talk, that senator can talk. I remember years ago, Ted Kennedy getting up there, and I can't remember what it was he was filibustering, but I remember him reading the DC phone book. And I'm pretty sure he was hammered, and it was just fun. It was funny to watch. He can do that. I'm not saying he should, but it is within Senate rules, and it's up to the Senate to vote 60 votes to overcome that filibuster. Okay? That is one of the possible outcomes. It has actually happened before. Okay? I've heard people say that it's never happened to a Supreme Court justice. That's actually not completely true. It did. I'm going to have to fly through and go back and forth. This is the problem with last minute. Okay. Sorry. We're actually not going to talk about him. We're going to talk about him. This has actually happened before. It actually is happening, at least the threat of a filibuster right now. And in some ways, the threat of a filibuster is, as you know, if you don't have the 60 votes to overcome it, the threat of a filibuster is as good of a filibuster, because why bring something to a vote if there's just going to be a filibuster and you don't have 60 votes for closure, okay? This has happened before, and interestingly, it happened in a fairly similar situation that we have now, okay? There was, I think you should have seen, there was a link to a website called scotusblog.org, SCOTUS, S-C-O-T-U-S, blog.org, where which without question has the best coverage of the Supreme Court of any website anywhere. And one of the things that they did is they went through, since 1900, every time there has been an opening on the Supreme Court that an outgoing president had to fill. The first time since 1900 that happened, it was actually Woodrow Wilson. And it was Louis Brandeis who was the nominee. And Brandeis got through. But that doesn't, and SCOTUS blog is correct on that. But it actually is a much lengthier story than that. I don't know if it was, I'm not enough of a historian to know whether the Senate had a problem with him being Jewish, which in 1916 they may very well have. He was going to be the first Jewish justice. I don't know whether or not it was a political move having to do with Wilson. But either way, no matter which it was, the Senate, for the first time in their history, made the confirmation hearings public. That had never happened before. And in some ways, these things have never been the same since. They asked Brandeis to come and testify. Brandeis refused. He said it was unseemly. He sent somebody else on his behalf. He ended up on the Supreme Court. Everything worked out. It was fine. However, something slightly different happened with Abe Fortas, and there were some in between. Abe Fortas was a justice starting in 1965, so he had gone through his Senate confirmation. He was an associate justice. Earl Warren stepped down, okay? Earl Warren stepped down. Lyndon Johnson wanted Abe Fortas to take his place as chief, okay? His nomination was essentially blocked by filibuster. It was only a 4-day filibuster. The problem was they found some ethical issues having to do with stocks. And so this was actually the one filibuster that blocked a nomination. Some people don't think of it that way because it went back and LBJ had another chance potentially to nominate somebody. But by this time, LBJ wasn't running for president. He was essentially a lame duck. He also had Nixon running against him and, and the Democrats, but really running against Earl Warren in his court. If anybody looks back at the 1968 election, this was the impeach Earl Warren time period that those stickers came out. And Nixon gave, on his stump speech, these liberal justices in Washington. I don't think he ever used Earl Warren's name in the stump speech, but that's who he was talking about. And so politically, Lyndon Johnson, I don't think, had the power to get another nominee through, and so Nixon ended up being able to put Berger on. If you had asked on Saturday, I would have told you that I thought this was the most likely outcome. That this was what I thought at the time was most likely to happen. Now that I've had some more time to digest and read some more news, I actually don't think it will. Ted Cruz might try this. Okay? Donald Trump may want this. I don't think the Republicans, I think it's too dangerous for them to step into it. Because, as I pointed out to a student yesterday, first he started saying that President Obama should not be allowed to nominate somebody, right? And I said, should not because he's president, so that means it's not part of his job. And he said, well, he's not going to be president for long. And I was like, well, he's president now. And he said, well, then I think, he thought the Republicans should filibuster. And so what I said to him was, okay, well, I think President Obama should. And so if you filibuster me, and if a Republican wins, and they get the nomination, shouldn't I tell my representatives who believe in what I believe to filibuster your guy? Well, they shouldn't do that. Well, of course they shouldn't do that then, because they're not doing what you want them to do. And I think that this is one of the big problems we tend to get into with these. We get very high and mighty about what we want, and we then go and find facts that match what we want. Okay, so we can then end up with the person on the court that's our person. Okay? So, and I'm happy to answer the question of what I would hope is going to happen eventually. I just think this is, I think there are people in the Republican Party who will want to filibuster. I think whoever the nominee is realizes that he is going to be a he, right? That he is going to have a really hard time getting votes if that's going on. I think it actually hurts him more than it helps him. Because the moderates, who may have been willing to vote for him before that, may go to the other side because he's supporting that that's going on. Does that make sense? So I'm starting to rethink that. Again, this is just what I think today. You know, depending on who President Obama nominates, and while we're sitting here, there could be text messages that I'm not reading. Oh, Obama's the nominee, that could change my opinion. So this is my opinion as of 1:35 on February 16th, Pacific Standard Time. Because really these things are changing hour to hour, which I think is both fascinating and a little disconcerting all at the same time. Okay? So just to go back a little bit, to, see, I'm going to talk about the short list before you ask me. To go back a little bit to the confirmation process, again, until 1916, the Senate, the confirmation hearings were closed to the public. In some ways, it's been all downhill since then. I'm not sure the public has actually made debate on who becomes the Supreme Court justice better. I'm not saying that we shouldn't know what's going on. I'm just saying it wasn't nearly as political in 1916 as it is now. You know, as recently as, you know, Souter ended up on the court in 92, I want to say, 91, 92, I think it was, 90. It was somewhere. It was during H.W. Bush's presidency. I think it was 1990. Souter was a Republican. He was a lifelong Republican. He was a circuit court judge. And when he became a justice, everybody said, well, you know, he's not really a Republican. He votes with the liberals all the time. Well, the truth is, when you get on the court, you're dealing with a whole world of issues that you may never have really dealt with before. Anybody who's either studies law or practices law will tell you that over the course of your career, you become really knowledgeable about very specific things. I mean, this is the beautiful part about going to school, is you learn a lot about a little, and you know nothing about anything else, which is why I know everything about Supreme Court history and nothing about how to dress when talking about Supreme Court history. Sorry about that. So, I mean, this is the truth. If you ask a doctor, they know, you know, a general practitioner is probably the smartest in the group, you know, but I don't want them doing my neurosurgery, right? Just like you don't want me representing your, you know, if you got a DUI and you call me, then you're in bigger trouble than I thought, because I'm not a lawyer. Therefore, nothing I say matters. All right. But, you know, until 1916, the public really didn't know. I don't know that the public didn't care. But even as recently as somebody like Souter could end up on the court and turn out to be nothing like what we thought he was going to be. Justice Stevens, who was appointed by Ford, he ended up being really the liberal stalwart in his last 20 years on the court. In 1975, did anyone think a Republican corporate attorney from Chicago, which is what Justice Stevens was at that time, would end up being the guy who wrote the great dissent in the gun control case in 2008? You know? I mean, I also didn't think when he retired 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, that he would write 5 books. Mind you, I've written one in 45 years, so that tells you how much more impressive he is at 92 than I am at 45. It's really, I mean, this is, if you ask me, somebody asked me if I believed in sort of term limits, and I always point to Justice Stevens, and I'm like, I wish he hadn't retired. I'm fine with him on the court still. You know, for every good person you want to see retired, there's always that bad one that you don't. Or that good one you don't, bad one. So, getting back to this, you know, in 1925, Harlan Stowe was the first nominee to appear in person. Can you even imagine if Justice Roberts, when he was up for Chief Justice, had said, I'm just not going to show up. I'm sorry I don't have time for your questions. You know, I have other things that I have to do right now. I can't even imagine that in a million years that that would have happened today. But in 1925, they asked him and he actually showed up, whereas Brandeis had refused. In 1955, it was the first radio broadcast hearing, which may have been really the death of the Supreme Court nomination process. And in 1981, Sandra Day O'Connor, there was so much attention on her being the first woman. She was a relative unknown. She had been an Arizona Supreme Court judge. It really was one that everybody wanted to watch and everybody watched on TV. And so now they're pretty much televised start to finish. There's something that happened behind closed doors. But it will be a fascinating process for everybody to watch. If we've learned anything from recent history, it's that, you know, I would say, you know, John Roberts was really, really good at really not saying anything, but knowing a lot about some things, but never appearing to be what was going to offend anybody. Okay? You know, Roberts made this very famous line, famous in nerd circles like mine, that he was just going to call balls and strikes. He was like an umpire. Now, that's fine if you understand baseball, but if you actually understand baseball, you realize that different umpires have different strike zones. So a nerd like me wants to know what's a ball and what's a strike, Mr. Chief Justice. But it was a great moment for him because he got to shut up the crowd, you know? Like, I'm just an umpire. And people went, that's great. It's like, oh, that's crap. It's just... However, you know, Roberts is incredibly bright. He's incredibly knowledgeable about constitutional law. He likely had more actual Supreme Court knowledge than anybody who's on that court now, before he got in the job. He had worked for the Solicitor General's office, and nowadays there's sort of a very, very expensive, exclusive subset of attorneys who will represent you if you have to argue in front of the Supreme Court, and he was one of those guys. Because he had the experience, and he was a court rankless. The guy whose job he was going to take. I mean, talk about perfect. And so, you know, when I think back to the Roberts hearings, you know, there was just so little information about him. And he was so smooth about it that I had no doubts that it was going to go through. Now, an interesting thing that somebody asked me yesterday, that whether I thought if things, you know, if things just didn't happen for a while, and then Hillary became president, did I think there was a chance that Hillary would nominate Barack Obama to be on the Supreme Court? Now, it's an interesting question, because on the one hand, he did go to Harvard Law, which is just like everybody else on the court, so he's got that. He did teach a class or two in constitutional law in Chicago, and he was president, so he did some stuff. This wouldn't be the first time in our history. Taft actually became Chief Justice after being president. So it has happened. Or was Taft a senator before that? Anyway, it wouldn't be that amazing, except I can't in a million years see this happen. Now, I would love it because President Obama, when he was Senator Obama, voted against John Roberts to become chief. So can you imagine that, like, conference? Because nobody takes notes in conference, so it's Roberts' time to finally say, go get me cups of coffee, Mr. Junior Justice, you son of a bitch. Like, because he has to go get the coffee because nobody's allowed in conference, right? So Roberts' revenge, it could be called. So for me, that's just funny. That doesn't make it good or bad for America, but it would be entertaining. You know, when I thought about it politically speaking, I just can't in a million years imagine that happening. Because I can't imagine the Senate letting him through. He's got too much of a record. he also, I mean, and I don't mean this as a critique, he's never been a practitioner and he's never been a judge. And that should not be what we look at. Okay? John Marshall, who I've talked about in here, was known as the Chief Justice. And he was Secretary of State before he walked into that building. You don't have to have had a law degree in order to have that job. You know, I have joked to you guys before that according to the Constitution, both of my nieces could be nominated. So hopefully they're sitting by the phone waiting for the president's call. He could nominate his daughter if he wanted to. Malia, is that her name? I forgot. Is that her? Am I saying it wrong? Malia. Malia? Yes. Okay. I thought you got it right. Okay. Presidential daughters are not in my realm of the little stuff that I know that's not in it. It's prisons and Supreme Court and very little. Anyway, getting back to it, you know, is it constitutional? Sure. Do I think the Senate would ever approve him specifically, especially if the Republicans are still in charge? No way. And Hillary's got her first nominee, you know, I mean, so there's a million political reasons why it shouldn't happen. Do I think it would be an excellent justice? I have no idea. I hate to say that, but I will show you the people who I think are going to be on the court. I don't know if they'll be good justices because we put people on there that we thought were going to be fantastic and they never did really much of anything. You know? But then we've had people we knew were probably going to be lousy. I mean, Fred Vinson ended up as Chief Justice because he played poker with Truman. And the most impressive thing he ever did was have a heart attack on the bench. I mean, that was it. And died and ended up with Earl Warren in his place. So, you know, that's pretty impressive, and I thought it was all right. But Earl Warren was a pretty good Chief Justice. But nobody in a million years would have guessed Earl Warren was going to be the Chief Justice he would become. He was the Republican governor of California. The same state that elected Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan in most of your lifetimes. So was there any reason to think when Earl Warren was put on the court by Eisenhower that he was going to become, you know, who he would become? I don't think people knew that William Brennan was going to become what he became. There's just no way to guess. Maybe Scalia not either. Hugo Black, certainly not. You know, Hugo Black was an Alabama senator who was a Klansman, and the most judging he had ever done was as sort of a police. It was sort of like a very, very low magistrate court. And when he got on the court, the other members of the court kind of thought his opinions that he wrote were ridiculous. This is the guy that sort of invented originalism on the court in his own way and became one of the most well-respected liberal justices in American history. But if I just said, well, he was a Klansman, I never would have thought he voted the way he did in Brown versus Board of Education, or he would believe fervently in free speech, all of those things. So I just want to make that statement about who's going to end up in there. Okay, so just a little bit more. There will be a lot of investigations that are going on. The nominee of the Senate does a pre-hearing investigation. The American Bar Association will chime in on how qualified they think the nominee is. The hearing will occur in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Debate occurs in front of the full Senate. The vote will take place in front of the full Senate. Now, if any of the question is what, as of 152, 150, 147? As of 1:50 p.m. Tuesday, February 16, 2016, if I had to guess what was going to happen, I'm going to guess that there is going to be a nominee, and I would guess that there is going to be a hearing, and I would guess that the Senate is going to vote him down. I say him because I have somebody who people seem to think is going to be the him. Okay? All of that is perfectly constitutional. It is absolutely, positively the Senate's job to advise and consent. If they vote down a nominee, as long as they've done their job, I don't know the reason why they want to do it. Why they do it, that's a good question. Hold on a second. Let me just finish. I want you to write questions over so I can get as many questions as I can. Okay? If you ask me what I think is going to happen, I will also start discussing the nominees. Because I think what will happen as of right now, that this is going to be the nominee that will be voted down. He is a DC Circuit judge. He is, when my student wrote this, I wasn't sure. Like I said, he's the most attractive potential Supreme Court nominee. I just meant right now, I kind of think that's what's going to happen, that it was attractive to a lot of people. Not that he's a good-looking dude. Like, he may well be a good-looking dude, but that wasn't my point at the time. Just to point that out. He was nominated by President Obama in June of 2012. He was confirmed in May of 2013 by a unanimous vote of the Senate. I think that's part of what makes him such an attractive nominee. Circuit judge. For the position he holds now as DC Circuit Judge. Okay? So, one of the reasons that I think he makes such an attractive nominee is because it's very easy for the Obama administration to appoint him and say, you voted for him unanimously the last time. Are you really not going to vote for him again? Now, the Republicans can say in response, and I think it's fair, and he's been a DC Circuit Judge since 2012. Well, he was nominated in 2012, so he's only been on the court for 3 years, less than 3 years. He doesn't have as much of a record. He doesn't have, and I think all of that is true. And so what makes him a good nominee, in some ways, is what made Roberts a really good nominee. He's incredibly bright. He's incredibly well-spoken. He knows the Constitution really, really well. He's a moderate. Anybody who tells you different is making stuff up. As a judicial, what we know about him, he is a moderate. He is not a hell-raising liberal. Okay, I'm sure people think differently, but I disagree completely. He is all of those things. He also doesn't have a long record. And these days, sadly, that's an advantage. It's an advantage. Alito had a longer record, and it was a more difficult hearing process. Because if you look back and you think about what these nominees go through, if you think about it, think about Justice Sotomayor and what you may remember about her nomination. I don't know how much you remember about it, but one of the things I remember is that in a speech once, she had said that she would make better decisions because she is a wise Latina woman. Wow, did that become fodder, okay? That wasn't about the decisions that she had made. That wasn't about her ability to do the job. That was about politics, and that is what this is going to happen. So before I take a break, because I really am running out of steam right now, so I need to sit and not speak for 5 minutes. I'm going to take a break, but what I want to make clear is that, unfortunately, I think what is best for the country is now no longer a part of the discussion. Okay? And if you want to ask me what I hope will happen in my dreams, okay? And I say this as a lefty liberal academic, okay? What I hope will happen is that, unbeknownst to any of us, President Obama and a few members of the Judiciary Committee will sit down and pick out the best candidate, and potentially a moderate, that everybody can agree on, that can get through the process. That's what I think is best for the country. I don't think for a second that that is actually what's going to happen. So I honestly really need a break to not speak. So I know a lot of you have questions. If I haven't answered your question yet, if you could write it up and leave it, and I'm going to kind of hide in the back so I can make sure my voice and my PowerPoint. Okay, so I want to move along the short list, because I think that this, as of right now, again, what kind of is happening, I want to answer a question and then comment on something. Short lists are about politics also, right? There are people on a short list as a favor, just to get their name out there a little bit. There are people on a short list who the president has no intentions of nominating, but he wants to scare the shit out of the other side and says, this is your worst nightmare. So maybe he puts himself on a short list and goes, if you wait for Hillary. I don't think he can, actually constitutionally, there isn't anything that could stop him from doing that, I don't think. God, wouldn't that be weird? Well, it'd be like, I don't know if you guys remember in 2000, Dick Cheney was tasked with finding the absolute best vice presidential nominee for Bush, and he found him when he looked in the mirror in the morning, it turned out. So, you know. So anyway, as I said, I think that, you know, this is somebody who appeals to everybody because of his age, or at least appeals to Democrats because of his age. He could have a very long term on the career, a long career on the court. You know, I think he's very appealing for a lot of different reasons. Some of them good, some of them not so good. And I, like some other scholars, actually think that this may be the nominee that President Obama eventually goes with the hopes that they will vote, and that it will, you know, not with the hopes that they'll vote and that he'll get turned down, but with the understanding that I don't think it's as likely right now that the filibuster is going to happen. Some of you asked, so I just want to answer this very quickly, what happens to them if they are not confirmed? And what happens to them is they go on with their lives. I mean, you know, Judge Bork was still Judge Bork after the Senate voted him down. I have a feeling there are some people, you know, Harriet Miers, who was nominated and then her nomination was pulled back. Do you remember this was, I think it was the Roberts actually, I can't remember exactly which one, but I have a feeling the fact that the discussion around her had to do with her lack of ability to do the job and really her lack of intelligence was really the critique on her. It might have hurt her career, but she was the counsel of the president, so somehow I think somebody hired her. You know, if you get to the point in your career where you end up as a Supreme Court nominee, chances is some Washington, D.C. firm will be happy to have you there as a partner. Abe Fortas ended up just fine and wealthy in Texas. You know, and I don't think he could be much more publicly embarrassed than what happened to him, which was not only did he not get the job of chief, he resigned as an associate. I mean, that's how ugly it got. So he didn't have to do that. He could have stayed on. He could have tried to force an impeachment. But just to give you an idea of that, we have impeached exactly one Supreme Court justice in our history. His name was Samuel Chase. It was in 1800, and he wasn't convicted. So we've never actually kicked anyone off the bench through impeachment. Usually what happens is, they figure out it's time to retire or resign, you know, when things are going ugly. This is, Paul Watford is a California Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals judge. When I thought, actually, this was something I actually read on SCOTUS blog. Originally, what Tom Goldstein of SCOTUS blog argued was that Watford was going to be the nominee and that the filibuster was going to happen. I thought it was an excellent point at the time. I really didn't see any downside for somebody like, you know, one of the senators who wants to be president. They certainly can filibuster if they want to. It's well within their rights. You know, and I thought he would be an interesting candidate. He also, I would say he is not nearly as moderate as the first candidate, whose name I really don't want to butcher, so don't make me. If he's the nominee, I promise I will learn how to say his name, but I'm a white kid from Maine and I do bad with names. Eric Williams I can handle and spell. Anything else? Yeah, even my brother Kenny, I misspell his name from time to time. So Paul Watford, I think, is somebody who is a very appealing candidate. He's very, very bright. He is certainly, I would say, on the political spectrum, or most people I think would call him a little more liberal than some of the other candidates. He's a former clerk for the notorious RBG. His list of judicial rulings is fairly short, which is sadly an advantage in confirmation battles. I think he would be an excellent jurist. I think he would be an excellent Supreme Court justice. I think his time hopefully will come down the road. I don't think it's going to happen right now. I think that probably the only way we end up with an Obama-nominated Supreme Court justice is if there is some kind of compromise, or if you as the American people fight so, if public opinion is so strongly against the Senate not confirming whatever nominee he chooses, I think that's probably more likely. I think a lot of this is going to be linked in with presidential politics, and it's sort of the unfortunate part of the world that we live in. Merrick Garland is also on the short list. He's the oldest person on the short list. He's 63. He's the chief judge for the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. He's a former federal prosecutor. He's been a federal judge since 1995. He has been filibustered once before when he was I think when he was up for chief judge, not chief judge, I think when he was up for his judgeship, he was filibustered. He's very, very bright. He has a very long history. I think it would be the ugliest confirmation hearings of any of the current members of the shortlist. It's why I kind of think I'm not sure that he's, I wonder if he's sort of the cautionary tale that we're going to put up the first guy and he doesn't have much of a record, so you're going to say we're not nominating him because he has a record, and so look kids, we've got Merrick Garland here, who's a little bit more of a lefty, and he's got a hell of a record. You can't say he doesn't have experience. It's all about playing the hypocrite card. So I miss Jon Stewart right now, because he would, on The Daily Show, he would do this better than anybody, so I hope he does. This is Patricia Ann Millett. I don't have her age up there. I forget it, and I think she's probably the least likely of all of these people to be nominated. She is a D.C. Circuit judge. She's a former Supreme Court litigator in the Solicitor General's office. I believe Elena Kagan was there when she was doing that. It really does make her somebody who knows the court very well. I don't know a lot about her, and so I'm going to stop there before I start making stuff up and embarrassing myself. Loretta Lynch is 56 years old. She's the current Attorney General of the United States. She took over after Eric Holder. She's a former federal prosecutor in New York. Her current position sort of complicates the nomination. She just went through a really difficult confirmation battle to become Attorney General. I think most of that had more to do with Eric Holder and a certain dislike for him, more than it did her lack of qualifications for the job. It's also really tough to be a sitting Attorney General and go through a Supreme Court nomination, because you really can't answer any questions. Because if you answer any question on any issue that any Attorney General, like Assistant Attorney General, is prosecuting or defending on at any level, you now have really made a mess of things for your office. And so, maybe that's an advantage that she can't say anything, which is sort of sad. But it would be interesting to see how often she was just like, that's not a question I can answer. I can't really deal with that, all of that. Okay, a couple things I did want to go through that were questions, and I want to talk a little bit about how the court is going to sort of function over the next period of time, depending on how long it takes to get somebody in there. Some people have talked about a recess appointment. There is some question as to whether the Senate is actually on recess right now. The court in 2014 made recess appointments much more difficult. Earl Warren, I think, was a recess appointment, and he worked out pretty well. There was another guy, I think his name was Pickering, from New Hampshire in the 1700s, who was a recess appointment, and they are pretty sure that he was alcoholic and had dementia, and so that one didn't work out so well 2 months later when they came to vote. He did get voted down, thankfully. Can the president do it? Sure. Do I think politically it's a particularly good idea? No. I mean, I think the Senate will look at it and argue that it's a screw you to them, trying to cut them out of the process. And so I just think, I think politically it's probably not a great idea. Are there any time limits on the different parts of the Senate process? No, they could delay. I mean, if you're in control of the Senate, really, you can delay. It's hard to force the ruling party. That's not what we call them here. The majority party. There are very few Senate rules that force the majority party to take something to a vote. That's why the filibuster is there, because you can debate forever. What would be an interesting move? Somebody asked about this yesterday. It used to be that there was sort of this, the Senate has always been a bit of a gentleman's club, despite allowing at least a couple of women in. It's always been sort of, they think of themselves as much different than the House. That the House is kind of involved in politics and that dirty stuff, and we're a little better than they are. And senators like to think of themselves that way. And in many ways, Hugo Black as a nomination, given that he was a senator, was a bit of a screw you to the Senate, because the way the Senate had always dealt with senators nominated to any confirmation, any office involving confirmation, was that the confirmation was very smooth and easy. So Hugo Black was nominated on a Sunday, and by Wednesday he was a Supreme Court justice, which is why they didn't find out about the Ku Klux Klan stuff until 6 months later, which they might have wanted to know when they voted. I'm not making fun of it. It's just that's what the Senate used to do. Does that mean that President Obama should say, Harry Reid, why don't you be the nominee, and see what happens, and see if the Senate lets him in by Wednesday? It's not going to happen. I don't think it would be good for the country either. But it's an interesting, this is a chess game that's going on right now. Unfortunately, it's a chess game with the American people's future on the line. So that makes it sort of sad. But I think it's one of those, as somebody who studies this stuff and somebody who teaches this stuff, it's a fun way to get people thinking about different things. And it's one of the few times maybe I can get my 21-year-olds interested in what the hell goes on at the Supreme Court, except when it's going to be on the exam. That they care about.